Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar that's going to present some really fascinating research that's been headed up by Brunel University. I'm afraid you can't see me, although I am chairing the session because I have had technical problems and can't show my video at the moment. So welcome to everybody that's there. If I can ask everybody, including the presenters, to please first of all mute their microphones so that we can reduce all background noise. I'm going to be starting by just giving a quick overview of what the session, the webinar, will look like, and then I'll introduce you to the panelists. So we're going to have about 20 minutes or so of discussion of presentation about the research we're here to talk about, and then we're going to have any clarification questions, and then we'll have a sort of guided discussion after that. So please feel free to add any of your questions as we go through to the chat box, and then at the appropriate moment we'll be able to bring those questions in. I think participants aren't able to speak on the in the webinar, but we will be able to read your questions and your comments. So please do keep those coming through the chat bar on the side of your screen. So without more ado, we're going to get started with the webinar. We've got 3 panelists speaking today. Perhaps we can show the webinar slide on the screen. I don't know if that's coming up. We have 3 panelists speaking. We'll be starting off with Nicola, who's leading the research to look at social transfers in Lesotho and Malawi. So Nicola, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Larissa. I think, yes. Okay, great to talk to everybody this afternoon. As Larissa mentioned, I've been running a research project over the past 4 years looking at social cash transfers and generational relations in Malawi and Lesotho. I just want to flag up at the start that this is a team effort. There's been 7 of us conducting the research, and the others might sort of chip into the webinar later, but it will be Thandie and myself presenting. The starting point for the research was really a recognition that while we know a good deal about the impacts that social cash transfers have on symptoms of poverty in the target groups, so particularly children and elderly people, things like increasing levels of consumption, nutrition, school enrollment, immunization, things like that, we don't necessarily have such an understanding of the wider impact. And from the perspective that poverty is something that's relational, it's not just about symptoms, what we set out to do was to generate some understanding of the relational impacts of social cash transfers. So impacts on family and community relationships, on generational relationships within families and communities, and particularly the impacts that you have as a sort of knock-on effect on those people and those households that don't actually receive the cash transfers, but are nonetheless in various ways affected by them. So the research is a 3-year comparative project funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council and DFID. It's unusual in many respects as a piece of research on social cash transfers because it is a qualitative research project, and it's undertaken in just 2 rural villages, one in Lesotho and one in Malawi, so that we could get a really in-depth understanding of how the cash transfers impact on those generational and family and community relations. So in Malawi, we've been focusing mainly on the government's social cash transfer programme, and in Lesotho, we've focused on old age pensions and the child grants programme. So we have 3 quite distinct cash transfer programmes there that we've been able to compare in various ways. Another notable aspect of this is that the field size, the 2 villages, are communities in which we conducted research about a decade previously. So we're known in those communities, and we have quite a lot of background knowledge of the individuals and the households in them. Just a quick bit of background on the cash transfers. So Lesotho's old age pension is a universal pension paid to all of those aged 70 or over, except people who already receive a government pension from having been employed by the government in the past. And it's quite a generous scheme. And it's been going since 2004 and entirely government funded. The child grants programme, on the other hand, is a much smaller amount of money paid quarterly, and it's targeted. It's targeted at households that are poor and have at least one child aged under 18. So it's around about 22% of households in the programme areas, which essentially are rural areas, all the rural areas of the country. So in the village where we were doing the research, there were 8 households receiving a pension and 7 receiving a child grant, and just 1 household that received both. Malawi's cash transfer scheme is a scheme which seeks to identify the most vulnerable, irrespective of age. So it is targeted on the basis of poverty, so it targets the lowest quintile in income of households and those who are deemed to be labour constrained, so households that have no able-bodied adults or have a dependency ratio greater than 3. And there are supplements within that scheme for children of school-going age. So in the Malawi village, we had 8 households that were in receipt of the social cash transfer. Most of the recipients were elderly women living with 1 or more children, but there was a few other types of households as well. And it's notable that we did the research in Cholo district where the payments have been very irregular. In terms of our methods, we have undertaken 3 main field visits to the communities in 2016, 2017 and 2018. The first visit was we profiled all of the households in the villages. We conducted interviews with young adults who had been part of our research 10 years previously. So these were young people in this sort of 18 to 34 age bracket. And we also did interviews with everybody aged 10 or over in all of the households that receive cash transfers. 2017, we did some participatory group workshops where we worked with the young adults to explore the impacts that they perceived that the cash transfers were having on families and on community relations. And in 2018, we went back and we brought policy people to the communities, and we undertook some activities that sought to explore the potential policy lessons from the research. We also had a PhD student, Roland Helmsteder, who's been doing his research alongside ours, and he's been looking at the policy context of these cash transfer schemes. What we're going to do for the rest of this presentation, myself and Thandie, is to explore 3 key policy findings that we have identified from our research. So first of all, we have really identified a major problem with household targeting, which seems to be based on very problematic misconceptions of the nature of the household in both of these communities. Secondly, we want to suggest from our research that social pensions have great advantages over the other types of cash transfer. Their benefits extend well beyond the individual elderly recipient into the wider families and communities. And thirdly, what we learned from the young adults is that they aspire to more than simply free money. They were uncomfortable with receiving cash transfers. We've written policy briefs on these, and those policy briefs are found on the website identified here, www.cashtransfersyouth socialprotection.org.net. So I'm going to talk about the first of these, and then Thandie will talk about the second two policy messages. So essentially, household targeting really makes false assumptions about households. And because it makes false assumptions, the households that end up being targeted for cash transfers appear to the local communities to have been selected on an arbitrary basis. And that's seen as unfair. And as a consequence, those who are targeted end up suffering from resentment and stigmatization within their communities. Two of the transfers that we have been looking at are targeted transfers, and they both target households. The Lesotho's Child Grants Programme targets households that are poor and have at least one child. Malawi's Social Cash Transfer Programme targets those that are in the lowest income quartile and labour constrained. For the purpose of targeting, both of them use a combination of proxy means testing and community-based targeting. Those methods have changed over time, but essentially they continue to use a combination of those two measures, both of which assume that you have relatively stable, unambiguous households. And that is the area that's really problematic. Because households, particularly in Southern Africa, have very porous, very fuzzy boundaries. People are moving in and out all of the time. These are communities that have very high levels of migration and have historically had high levels of migration. Household membership is very unstable. But it's not only people that move in and out, but also money. Many of the migrant household members are working elsewhere and will periodically receive income, not necessarily on a regular basis, but that income is very significant for the rural households if sons or daughters or brothers send remittances back home. But it's almost impossible to take account of those remittances in undertaking proxy means testing. There were also issues in terms of births and deaths. It's proven very hard in both communities to have new births registered and taken account of in the cash transfer programming. And where people die, there's a reluctance within the community to report deaths. In Malawi, there was a very strong belief within the community that transfers are actually a heritable property. So when one person dies, they simply pass it on to a relative. And of course, these are communities, these are societies where resources are governed by particular rules. Different types of resources have different expectations attached to them in terms of entitlement and sharing of the resources. So there are particular expectations about who is entitled to the money, how it should be shared, and very often there's an expectation that it will be shared beyond the individual household in which the recipient is living. Just as an indication of the fluidity of these households, I've put a chart here that shows the 8 households in the village of Malawi. And 7 of these 8 households changed in their membership between our first visit, when we profiled the households in 2016, and our third visit to the village in 2018. So across a 2-year period, there had been change in the composition of 7 of the 8 households. And it's noteworthy that the 8th household, while there was no change, there was a 7-year-old daughter who was staying with her grandmother elsewhere in the village, and where the family were clearly seen as financially responsible for the daughter, even though she wasn't actually resident there. So this transfer is targeting households on the basis of dependency ratio, and yet the composition of the household is constantly changing. Just one particular example that I want to give where there is a clear anomaly in terms of the targeting. Grace was a 14-year-old girl living with her great-grandmother. The two of them lived alone in a mud, grass-thatched cottage in the village in Malawi. There were no appreciable assets. It looked at the surface like a typical household of an elderly woman caring for an orphan. The elderly woman died, and her great-granddaughter inherited the cash transfer from her. This was seen as the appropriate way of treating it because the great-granddaughter was the second named person on the transfer. But when her great-grandmother died, Grace moved back to her parents, and her parents were living probably within 10 meters of the great-grandmother's house. And her father had a salaried job on the tea estate and was probably one of, if not the wealthiest households in the village. And yet, strictly according to the criteria, Grace and her great-grandmother qualified for a social cash transfer. So it's very clear that there's a perception in these communities that those households receiving grants are not the most deserving. And even we attempted to do a little bit of an objective assessment as to whether cash transfers were going to the most needy. And in the Lesotho village, we took our information from our household profiling exercise. We used that and computed using the criteria that go into the National Information System for Social Assistance proxy means test database. And we identified using that there were 14 households with children in the village that could be considered particularly vulnerable. Some of them did receive child grants, but not actually the two with the lowest scores. And we also used a calculated a multi-dimensional poverty index for the village. And again, the results there did not match up with those that were actually receiving the child grants. So we end up with people telling us things along the lines of these quotations. To other people, it's as if I'm getting it by mistake. Sorry. Went one in here in the house and finds this bag of maize, not knowing what I've done to get it, while he has nothing. Or they're jealous because they think the beneficiaries have got a better life than those who don't receive the money. And there was a really widespread perception in both communities that everyone should receive something. It's not fair to try and target certain households and not others, particularly where there's no clear reason for those being targeted. So again, we have a woman saying it's not good. It was not a good arrangement that one has to receive while her friend's not. If only everybody benefited from it, that would be great. We're praying that others be helped also. This is said to be social development, so others need to be helped so that we can all move forward. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Thandie now, who's going to talk about the benefits that social pensions bring to communities.
Thandie, Hi, Thandie, yes. We can hear you. If you're able to put a video, that would be great too.
Okay, great, fantastic. All right, I lost some parts of Nicola's last bit, but I think I can carry on from here. So we've been working on this work, and as Nicola mentioned, we have two other policy key policy issues that came out of this research. So what I'll be doing is to talk about the social pensions and the youth aspect.
Hi, Thandie. I'm afraid I can't hear you. Thandie, you there? It looks like we might be having connection issues. Nicola, would you be able to take over from Thandie if she's not able to present?
I can do. Shall I do that, or?
Yeah, Thandie, maybe when you come back in. Yeah. Maybe you take over, and then if she comes back online, then we can bring her back in.
Okay. Shall I go back to my slides, or can you pass the Karina? Can you pass it back to me? Great. Okay, I've just realised I took rather longer than I intended to talking about that. So I'll make this a little bit quicker. Okay, so basically the elderly, there was a strong sense in both communities that the elderly are deserving. That if you're going to
I can hear you now.
Okay. Can hear you?
Yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I don't know what's happening now. I think it's probably in the exchanges. Anyway, so what we found based on.
Yeah, you talk about it and I'll change the slides. Is that easiest?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Great. Okay. So what we found based on the social pensions is that they seem to extend beyond the individual recipients who are the elderly here. They seem to go, people could benefit, the families could benefit, as well as the communities could benefit. And so there were benefits beyond the direct beneficiaries. We also noted that cash transfers to the elderly tended to benefit their own families. In particular, a lot of research on Lesotho has highlighted how much orphans and vulnerable children tend to benefit from these transfers. But we were also very much interested in finding out that communities as well tended to benefit quite a lot. And hence the reason why they seem to have a wider support from communities, even non-beneficiaries. Next slide, Nicola. Next. Next. Okay, great. If we look at this particular slide, we found that communities tended to benefit specifically because the elderly could have young people to work for them. So young people did casual work for the elderly. They would collect firewood for them. They would collect water, fetch water for them. They would smear their houses for them. They could even be sent to collect that very money, which in essence they would be paid to go and get. And so the communities tended to benefit from that. But also even business owners within the community were benefiting. We had one person who was owning public transport who would be able to transport these elderly on specific days, and therefore that was a huge benefit for that particular person. But we also had businesses like a small community store or shop where people, the elderly, would use their money to buy things. So there seemed to be wider impacts there. And then within the household as well, the elderly were also gaining huge autonomy as they were able now to be able to take care of their own business, but also to be able to take care of the other family members. The elderly people emphasized a lot of benefit to their grandchildren in particular. The story of Mantabiseng was interesting to us because we realized just that the complexity that the elderly pension was bringing to the fore. Mantabiseng, as a 90-year-old widow, was living with her son and her son's family, and they were sharing, eating from the same pot. But Mantabiseng had her own autonomy, which she didn't have before she gained their pension. She was now able to buy things for herself without asking the son to support her. She was able to make decisions about how her money was going to be spent, which in some way caused some conflict within the household. So they would complain that Mantabi saying was hoarding the money and was not bringing to the table for the family to make decisions on it. And she felt it was her money to make decisions because she was even making decisions in terms of who to pay to collect it for her. She was not collecting it herself. She was sending someone outside the family to collect it for her, which brought some bit of conflict. She was also able to use that money to loan the family, which they felt, no, she was not supposed to loan us money. She's supposed to partake in the purchases of the household. So she would give sometimes, but she would loan them sometimes. But she also took a lot of pride in her ability to be able to support her grandchild, who was now an orphan. So we see that kind of empowerment within the household, but we also see empowerment within the community as they were able to assist communities in terms of small casual activities for them. Next slide. All right. So in essence, we are saying cash transfers to the elderly seem to have wider spread as well as wider support. So when communities were asked if it was fair to be giving the elderly the money, everybody seemed to be quite okay with the elderly receiving. They seemed to be okay with them as recipients. Even in non-recipient households, they were happy that elderly people were receiving. The shame and stigma that we would discuss in a bit regarding cash transfers going to younger people did not seem to become about, even though this was still free money for older persons. And they seem to also be to have wider political support from the communities that elderly people should all be receiving their pension. It was interesting as well with the case of Malawi, where although the targeting was not on elderly people themselves, but there seemed to be a lot of elderly people compared to younger ones that were receiving the cash transfer. And so in essence, the community that participated in choosing who was supposed to receive seemed to be okay with elderly people receiving the cash transfer. So they seem to be seen as deserving beneficiaries. Next slide. All right. Now, there was an interesting take when we looked at cash transfers going to younger people. And I have to say, younger people, as Nicola mentioned, were receiving cash transfers on the simple basis that they were parents to children living in vulnerable and poor households. So they were receiving this indirectly to benefit their children. Next slide. Next slide. Next. All right. So young people had an interesting dilemma that, yes, albeit the poverty that we're seeing in the communities, young people felt that they did not want free money. They felt like they were receiving free money, seems to suggest that they are not able nor are they willing to work. In fact, we noticed that in Lesotho, the money was called Sewahudimu, which simply means money falling from the sky, which carried negative connotations within the communities, and young people receiving them were also not very happy with it. In Malawi, this was called, there was a connotation that free things kill, which suggested that this free money that they were receiving can come back and bite them. So that in itself seemed to suggest that young people were not happy receiving it, but also the communities themselves were not happy to receive it. In fact, we have interesting quotations where a young man in Malawi was saying, they always say that if you're receiving cash transfers, one day they will come to suck your blood from it. So it's like receiving cash transfers, you are kind of selling your own soul. In Lesotho, there was a young man who was receiving the cash transfer on behalf of his children whom he was not living with. And then the community was not happy with him. And he reported that people would just come whenever he had received the money and knock on the doors and want to make claims to that money, because it's like you have not earned it, you're not deserving of this money. Next slide. Next. All right. So in this last slide, we just wanted to share with you an interesting song that young people composed in demonstrating their frustration as young people. We are talking about situations of high unemployment among young people. And so they didn't, and what is interesting, you will see that they're not mentioning cash transfers as a solution for them. Instead, they are asking for work, significant work. So they are saying, we are unfortunate that we do not have any money and that we do not have jobs. And we truly wish that we can get help from authorities to get jobs and also to get markets to sell their produce. I mean, they are herders, so they have animals, and the agricultural bit that they would be tending, and to be taught how to drive cars and forklifts. And indeed, it is a way of surviving. For instance, we have grown vegetables. We should have markets so that our vegetables can be grown. So this was just a song that was interesting, with young people demonstrating their frustration that they are able and they are willing to work, and they did not necessarily see cash transfers as a solution, rather being provided with employment opportunities. I think I'll end right here.
Great, thank you very much, Thandie. So just before we go on to our final panel member, for him to speak, I'm just going to very quickly give you a quick introduction to the panelists, because I wasn't able to do that at the start as I was having technical problems. Our first speaker was Nicola Ansel, who is Professor of Human Geography at Brunel University. And she focuses a lot on social and cultural change in children in the global south, the policies that are needed to respond to this. And she also runs the Master's Program in Children, Youth and International Development at Brunel. Next up, we had Thandie Hlabana, and she's a lecturer in social policy at the University of Lesotho in the Department of Sociology. And her main areas of interest are in older persons, youth, gender, and sexual and reproductive health. And our final panel member, who is just about to speak, is Andre, and he is a social protection technical officer at the ILO in Malawi, and he leads on Malawi social protection work for the ILO. He's got over 10 years of experience in system strengthening and has expertise in social protection design and policy and financing capacity building. So those are our panel members. I'm sorry for not introducing them at the start. And just quickly to introduce myself, I'm Larissa Pelham. I'm the Social Protection Advisor in Oxfam's Global Humanitarian team. And we haven't been involved in the research, but I was so interested in the research when it came out that I thought we needed to get it out to the wider world, hence why we're chairing this webinar today. So many thanks to all of you that have already submitted questions. I would just encourage you to keep the questions coming. We'll take clarification questions first of all after we've given Andrea a chance to speak. And please give your name and your organization your position when you ask questions. Okay, so Andre, over to you.
Lisa, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Thandie, for the wonderful presentation. I'll be giving a few comments and findings regarding the research and their findings on Malawi, which is the country where I'm based on and can provide proper context on. And I think that what this research really adds to the discussion of social protection in Malawi is the nuance on the dynamics in the community level, and the perceptions of the different programs and how they are being implemented at the ground level. So, in general, social protection in Malawi, it has perhaps a gap between expectations and the impacts that they want to be obtained in social protection. And one of the reasons that, from a bigger perspective, is that the development needs of the country far exceed the reach of the SDP. The social cash transfer program currently covers only 10% of the poorest of the country, while you have 20% of the population living below the ultra poverty line, which is more or less the food poverty line, the minimum calories you need to consume per day, and you have more than 50% of the population living below the standard national poverty line. So in general, although there is vast evidence of the positive impact on the beneficiary households and the spillover effects that these households have in their communities, coverage still remains limited. And one of the impacts that this results is that the community doesn't really understand very well, as Nicola and Thandie was putting forward. They don't understand very well who gets what and why. And one of the reasons is that the key targeting mechanism used in the SDP, the proxy means testing, is used more as a resource rationing tool to make sure that the program at least is trying to reach the most vulnerable among the vulnerable, because there is not enough resources to cover everybody. And since poverty is dynamic, the difference between the lowest decile of the poorest decile of the population and the fifth decile is not that big. It's very hard for the communities to understand, why did I get it, but my neighbor did not? Why did my brother get it, since he has more capacity to work and I did not? So this results in disputes, in conflicts, in envy, and all those issues that were being discussed. And it also leads to an underlying overall perception that there is the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, where if you look at the poverty lines and you look at the well-being of the population, it's pretty clear that most people should be receiving some type of protection, some type of support, so they can live at least a minimum level of living. So this confusion leads to many issues that come up with the targeting process, and leads to this general frustration with the program. On top of that, there is some expectations that those receiving the support will be able to graduate from poverty. And from one of the points that really stand out from this research is how the youth come across as really willing to not be living on the social cash transfers, but really wanted to work for themselves, stand for themselves, and live their lives as they want to, and which contradicts a lot of perceptions that the recipients of cash transfer usually wants just to lean against the transfers and lead an easy life. People have more aspirations than that, and that doesn't change if they're poor, if they're rich. People want to live better lives. But for the youth to really live their best, the social cash transfer is not enough. They need access to opportunities, they need access to markets, they need access to decent work, not any work, but work that really helps them, that really promotes their quality of life, that they are not exploited, that they receive fair wages. Moreover, for graduation to take hold, it's important that the benefits are adequate and they are regular. And in Malawi, we see there's still a lot of issues to keep transfers being delivered regularly to all the beneficiaries. The levels of the benefits are still quite low compared especially to the cost of living, which has been increasing in the last few years. And as I mentioned, poverty is dynamic. If data is not collected regularly and updated, a PMT assessment that comes, who looks at the community, orders them towards the richest to the poorest, in a year's time, depending on the shocks, depending on the conditions of the market, depending on the harvest, the positions of most of these people in the score of their PMT could have changed, and someone who was in a better position last year could be starving this year. So the implications of this is that there are needs to be efforts to change a bit the situation. And as I discussed with Nicola when she was in the country last time, I think this report, this study sheds a lot of light into some of the issues that the real implementation of the cash transfer faces in the community level, and not only the theoretical problems that policymakers at the central level and technocrats usually see as the implementation of the program should run. So in terms of some policy implications, the message that comes clear of this study is most people would think that others deserve to receive some support. So this reinforces the idea that gradual increase of this STT coverage would be very welcome by the population and would be very positive for the development of the country, not only for the beneficiaries, but also for the communities. As they bring more purchasing power, they can hire their neighbors, they can buy from the village stores. Also, considering how the PMT is difficult to understand and to apply in a very effective way, the categorical targeting should be considered in lieu of the PMT, perhaps starting with older persons, people with disabilities, which are clearly seen as within the communities as deserving of support, and as we saw from the example from Lesotho, don't keep the benefit just for themselves, but they benefit their families and their communities. Moreover, advancing the linkages between social protection measures and with resilience measures and productivity interventions is very important to make sure that the youth, if they are connected to social protection programs, they are also connected to interventions that will help them find decent work, that will help them stand on their own feet, that will help them increase their productivity so that they do leave the stigma of being supported while they should be supporting themselves behind, and they can actually achieve the goals of many of these programs, which is to lift people out of poverty. And lastly, one of the points that perhaps was not fully touched by our presenters was that there seems to be a disconnection between the perception of policymakers and the communities, more on how the dynamics work at local level. So implementing stronger social accountability tools, which can really give the voice to the community so they can voice their concerns, voice their priorities, could help the policymakers understand more what are the needs on the villages, on the local communities, and help them to do this, to take decisions that will help improve the well-being of those communities, addressing their specific needs. For now, this is the few comments I wanted to put forward, and thank you very much for all who are attending this webinar.
Great, thank you, Andre, and thank you to all the panelists for your presentations. We're now going to go into a round of questions. We've got about 40 minutes or so, a bit less than 40 minutes left for the webinar, and we've had some fantastic questions online put through the chat box, so please keep those coming. Firstly, a couple of clarification questions for Andre in Malawi. Could you just explain a little bit about how often the household survey is done and how accurate it is, and how it's kept updated? Because presumably that's one of the big issues with targeting as well.
Okay, very briefly, it depends from district to district. So some districts manage to do it yearly, some districts do every 4 years, depending on the availability of resources and how the implementation scheme of the program is going. The government aims to standardize this to to register 100% of households in all districts and do full data update every 4 years, but with smaller sample updates in shorter amount of times, but still not would not be covering the full data set every year.
Great, thank you. And another question for either Nicola or for Thandie. Could you just explain about whether a bit more about the CBT in Malawi and community-based targeting? Was that seen as an arbitrary process? And were there high inclusion and exclusion errors as they were looking to target youth?
Yes, I mean, perhaps Andre is actually probably better placed than I am to talk about the CBT in Malawi. But I would say that from the community perspective, most people were really unaware of what was happening. Most people did not know how the targeting took place. They had a vague notion that people had gone to a neighboring larger village in order for a meeting, but there was a general perception that the chief was involved in this, which the chief was not inclined to dispel that view. So I think there is a CBT process that happens, but the extent to which that has widespread acceptability is perhaps limited, given that that people don't have the information about what's happening. So I think a real minority of people are involved in it. And if we look at Lesotho again, the CBT process took place in another village. The chief selected 2 people to go. One of those people told me, I know it's not supposed to be the chief doing the selection. I know we're supposed to be elected by the village, but that's just how it happened. So this process really doesn't have that higher level of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do any of your panelists want to add anything? Okay.
No, I'm okay.
Okay, thank you. Going on to some of the other questions that have been raised already. From Bernd Schubert, he points out from the report that 2.4% of GDP is used for the Lesotho pension. So that absorbs most of the social assistance budget for Lesotho, and yet it only reaches about 4% of the population, whereas if there are about 1 million children, 250,000 of which are very poor and vulnerable, and yet they only receive about 0.2% of GDP towards social assistance. So his question is really about, doesn't this look like a very expensive program, and doesn't it bypass many of the very poor and vulnerable people in Lesotho through the social pension?
Shall I just give a quick answer to that, which is that this is sort of based on a misunderstanding of what happens to that money when it arrives with the parents or with the elderly, because very often the elderly are grandparents and are spending money on their grandchildren. And so it may be 4% of the population that are the direct recipients of the pension, but that 4% are spending it on children, they are spending it within the community so the money goes to poorer community members who help out with things like collecting water or helping on the fields. And those are often parents of children. So I think what we were finding was there was a sense within the community, and we found this from the participatory group activities that we did, there was a real sort of sense that if money goes to elderly people, they spend it, and they spend it in a pro-poor way within the community. If money goes to young adults who are parents of children, that money gets spent outside the community. Their own children may benefit, but their own children are not necessarily the most vulnerable children within the community. And it doesn't have that sort of widespread community benefit. So I mean, almost this is the sort of case that we're arguing against through our research, really. The idea that you can target individuals on the basis of a particular criterion, and the money simply goes to those individuals. It doesn't go to the individuals, it gets spent in various different ways.
Mm-hmm. And also, I just want to add that the bigger spillover effects have to be really acknowledged. With the ability of the children to be able to wear proper uniform now that there's money, they're able to go to school, they're able to partake in community activities and school activities that they would otherwise not partake in. And therefore, people would drop out of school simply because they don't have school shoes, simply because they don't have uniforms, simply because they don't have a calculator that's required for a mathematical examination.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go on with a few more targeting questions because that's raised a lot of interest from the attendees. Irene among Lutz, I don't know which organisation she's from, but she said, what solutions, Nicola, could you suggest to the inclusion and exclusion errors that you've highlighted, given resource constraints in the country? And she suggests is universal targeting, universal transfers. Is that the answer? And maybe at the same time, you can then talk about the flip side of that, is when considering that often there isn't sufficient money to do the targeting, or for everybody to receive transfers. In a smaller level project, well then how do you propose to go about targeting? What might be a better way of doing, or a fairer way, or more transparent way of doing targeting?
Yeah, I mean, I am inclined to think that universal targeting or categorical targeting is really the only sensible way forward, because I think it is so, particularly to target households, seems to be so problematic. Categorical targeting targeting those age 70 and over isn't going to necessarily capture all of the, it's not necessarily going to benefit all of those who are in need. But in relation to children, my view would tend to be that it would be better to have a universal targeting of children under 3, perhaps, rather than trying to target 20% of children under 18. It would be seen as clear cut. It would probably have some sort of knock-on benefits in terms of getting children sort of into clinics and immunized and those sorts of things, and improve nutrition in that age group. But it would also have a much wider social acceptability if all children, or say all rural children under the age of 3, were beneficiaries, rather than a selection and a slightly random selection of those under 18.
I mean, we do acknowledge the fact that it is quite a dilemma when you are talking about a poor country or poor countries where poverty is very rampant. And at the same time, you're saying you want to select some and not others. And there's a gray line between those you are selecting and those you're not selecting. So those exclusionary and inclusionary errors are certainly there. Hence, we're thinking of advocating for something like universal support.
And what would the 3 of you suggest, so in cases where you can't do universal, if you're not talking about a government program, say you're taking the case of many of the attendees on the webinar, that maybe you're working for an NGO and you've got a smaller scale project, what if you even if your categorical targeting is beyond what the financial means are of your program, do you think from the research there is any advice you can give or suggestions you can give as to the best way of doing targeting in those situations?
I mean, I do think that's a real challenge. I do think it's a challenge, and I am skeptical of, as I say, of household level targeting. I mean, I would say that in Malawi, the community that we worked with had experienced, they'd been targeted for humanitarian assistance alongside the social cash transfer program. And the targeting of that was way more arbitrary than the social cash transfer program itself, because the NGO that was involved simply didn't have an adequate database. They didn't have knowledge. And this is where perhaps the databases have some potential value in giving some indication. But and clearly different in a sort of humanitarian situation, then I guess who is vulnerable will differ depending on the situation anyway. And those databases might allow for some slightly more accurate targeting, but I just think it's going to be seen as unfair if it's not universal. I don't know whether the answer is to select the worst affected communities and target universally within those communities, or some other sort of means of allowing the community to decide what the priorities should be within a community. But clearly that's highly sort of potentially that's much more controversial than having some outside body determine who receives income. So it's not straightforward.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to the targeting a bit more later on, but just to move on to some of the other questions. One that's just come through for Nicola again is, you mentioned some of the anomalies in your project. Were they due to design or to implementation issues?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
But the problems that were encountered through the project, some of the issues that you mentioned, I mean, you've already talked about targeting.
Okay. I think fundamentally it's design, and it's the design that's problematic, because the design is a design that cannot be readily implemented. I mean, to some extent it's at both levels, because I mean, if the design is about targeting households, and those households are not resurveyed for 4 years, inevitably it will not go to the households that are most, or households will move in and out of poverty over that time. And there are problems, I think, particularly in the Malawi cash transfer program, where it's based around dependency ratio and just doesn't take account of the interdependencies between households, and the fact that household composition changes all the time. I mean, those are clearly design problems. There are some implementation problems, certainly, but I think ultimately at the root of those implementation problems, there's often a design fault. So implementation, there isn't the case management happening that is technically supposed to happen, but that's partly because at the community level or at the local level, the way that these schemes are reinterpreted means that it's very, that the rules are just understood in a different way. I mean, Andre mentioned the sort of mismatch between community level understanding of the programs and the policy level understanding. And one of the things that we did do and that we didn't talk about was we took policy people into the communities, people from, in Lesotho's case, from the ministry. In Malawi, it was from the sort of district level, to talk to each other, really. And there clearly was a very different understanding of what was happening among those two groups of individuals. But so it may be partly about lack of information getting to the community level. But I think even if the information gets there, there will be a desire to reinterpret the rules to fit with local understandings of need, of how resources should be distributed.
Great, thank you.
I also just want to
go ahead.
I want to add, Larissa, that when the communities were asked if they felt that the recipients were not deserving, they were generally feeling that they are deserving, but so are we, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm saying when you have that, targeting becomes a serious problem.
If I may add to that, I think that comes to the real issue of how targeting is done in Malawi, is that the underlying goal of it is to try to ration who will get the benefits and who will not in a more or less structural way, because there are not enough resources in the sector to really cover the whole population that should be that would be deserving of the cash transfer. And just linking quickly with the comment, with the question of would be categorical and universal possible? In the short run, immediately, it would probably not. But every country has the capacity to finance university programs if they start with the priority groups, and if they start gradually increasing the coverage. You can start with the elderly, with a higher age bracket. You can start, as Nicola suggested, with children between 0 and 3, because it's where the long-term impacts are higher. And it's really for each country to decide on its own what are the key priorities and where to start. But in the long run, the most sustainable and the most socially just way of looking at social protection will be at providing social protection to all as a human right, as it is.
Great, thank you. I think I'll probably speak directly to one of Bernd Schubert's other points, which he mentions. What about the youth? I mean, when Malawi is targeting the labour-constrained households, that means by definition, those with labour and the youth are not going to have access to that support. So where is how are they going to be getting social assistance? And you've already mentioned some of the employment schemes and so on, that, you know, the need to have access to decent employment. I don't know if there's anything more you want to add to that, Andre.
I think besides the access to public works programs as it is designed, you have the social cash transfer as the direct cash transfer, and you have the public works programs which target then ultra poor households with labor capacity, which would cover also these youth members. But even in the SCTP, one of the criteria is to define labor constraint is to have a dependency ratio larger than 3. So, a single parent household with 4 children, even if the parent is working, is considered labor constrained, because the weight of providing is very heavy on one breadwinner, and that would escalate, of course, to other configurations of households. So it's not only the elderly, the disabled, and the children, but also households that depend too heavily on the working adults.
Great, thank you. A quick point that somebody's mentioned from Asia, I think in Thailand they have found that social pensions, similarly to the findings from Lesotho, the social pensions are spent in the community and help stimulate the local economy. So there's sort of some cross-regional comparisons there. Reflecting on the kind of size of the research, another attendant has asked, what about how scalable are these findings? Do you think you can extrapolate the findings from Lesotho and Malawi to the populations at large and maybe even beyond?
What's been interesting to me is I spent a week or so in each of Malawi and Lesotho a couple of months ago, talking to people in the policy field, so people from government as well as from the funding bodies, various agencies, NGOs. And the thing that really struck me was how far our research chimed with their sort of anecdotal knowledge of the cash transfer scheme. People would tell me, you know, this is our experience, this is what we're hearing, but it's not what's getting uncovered through quantitative survey research, which is undertaken as evaluations of programs and is concentrating very largely on the intended beneficiaries and not on the wider community. So I do think, you know, it does appear that our findings really resonate with the experiences that people have from other communities. And I see no reason why these communities would be really distinct from others. I think there's perhaps a slight difference in the Malawi community in as much as it's Cholo district, and Cholo district is sort of acknowledged to have been the least successful in implementing the social cash transfer program. But we did do a little bit of research in a village in Mulanje district there. We got similar findings. The only thing I would say with the Mulanje village is I had much more of a sense that people were telling us what they thought we wanted to hear, because they were less familiar with us. And in the two villages where we've been known for a decade or more, I think people were more sort of honest with us and open about the impacts on, you know, social relations. So I think there is a real sort of value in this sort of small scale in-depth research that just throw up things that are common across these countries, but which is not uncovered with other sorts of research.
Thank you, Nicola. And sticking with this question of whether these communities were perhaps different or similar to other communities, what about issues around markets? Did you find that the communities, given that they had cash transfers, did you have any kind of findings on whether markets in communities with cash transfers were different, were operating in any kind of different way, or were more active to those without cash transfers? I don't know if you could say anything about that.
I suppose that's something that the nature of our research means that we can't really answer that question, because we didn't do research in communities that don't have cash transfers. I would suggest that other than the pension in Lesotho, the grants are probably too small to have much of an impact on markets. The Lesotho pension had stimulated certainly a lot of sort of savings and loan activities, mainly among the elderly themselves within the communities. But there was a sort of sense there that elderly people were sources of potential income. And there was a sort of sense among young adults that we talked to that they were sort of propping up the shops and that sort of thing, that they were really sort of stimulating markets for small shops within the communities. But I think that the smaller targeted transfers probably weren't sufficient to really see a notable impact. As I say, in both countries, when we talk to young people about the community level impacts, they said where money goes to young adults with children, those young adults will spend the money on their children, but they'll spend it outside the community. They'll buy school uniforms, shoes, those sorts of things. They don't give away money, they don't loan it out, they don't spend it in the community.
Thank you. And Roland has just posted a link to a blog on socialprotection.org where you talk about the issues of community perceptions and how that has complicated the implementation. So maybe that can be shared after the webinar. But going back to your questions around sort of the ability to use cash transfers and sort of have multiplier effects from that, a question that came from, I think, a former minister in Pakistan, a former minister of Pakistan's social safety net, the BISP. Given that one of the issues for the youth was that they said that free things kill, was there any opportunity or was there any kind of creativity or innovation for them to use that cash transfers and put that into savings and entrepreneurship? And did that then change the way those cash transfers were seen and make them more acceptable?
Okay. Maybe I'll speak for Lesotho. For young people who are receiving the cash transfers, I think we had one who was running a small, tiny little shop selling sweets and snacks. But you have to also appreciate the fact that the money is very minimal. It only comes after 3 months. And so during the interim period, it's basically within communities, it's basically the elderly that are probably fueling business within the community. And I think the main reason that young people were advocating to do that was just, well, it's minimal. Yes, they appreciate the money. It's minimal though to meet all their needs. And so I would say at least we didn't feel like there was a sense that they could do much more.
Mm. It was the idea of having sufficient income to use it in entrepreneurial ways. It was certainly something that was quite popular among the young people. I think perhaps even more so in Malawi than it was in Lesotho. I remember the young men talking about, you know, if they had money targeted at them, and if it was sufficient, then there were all sorts of ways in which they could use it that would be income generating. Mm. But currently it's, not enough.
Great, thank you. Just a couple of very specific questions. Are the transfers in either Malawi or Lesotho, are any of them pegged to inflation? What's the procedure for potentially, increasing the transfers with price rises?
I don't know that they're explicitly pegged to inflation. In Lesotho, they seem to be pegged to elections as far as the pensions go. Whenever there's an election, all parties promise to raise the pension, and so there've been a lot of elections recently, and the pension's gone up quite a lot. But I don't think there's any sort of strict index linking.
Okay.
No.
I can clarify that there is no automatic mechanism for updating the values of the social cash. Most of the resources come from donors, so the updating of the value comes ad hoc when it's felt that is necessary. The government is trying to explore tools to make it automatic, so that even the program will adjust itself. But this is still discussions ongoing.
I think this is one of the areas actually where you see a difference between the pensions, the social pensions, and the other grants. That the social pension, because it has such widespread acceptability and popularity among the population, the government feels a need to be responsive and to raise it, whereas political parties wouldn't get the same sort of popularity by promising to raise something like a child grant that is very contentious in the first place. And so if you want political buy-in for a social cash transfer program, if it's universal and if it goes to those who are seen as worthy beneficiaries, then you're going to get much stronger political buy-in and a much higher level of commitment for spending on the part of the government.
Great, thank you. Another question, a little bit related. In Malawi, the social transfer, what proportion of household food needs and basic needs does it meet?
You mean in terms
I didn't get the question? Can you say that?
You mean the size of the transfer?
Yes, sorry. What size? Yes. How much does it cover the base of the minimum basket?
I'm not sure whether there's a, I mean, I'm guessing it's been originally calculated in relation to a notional basket. It is very small, but I do know that the early evaluations suggested that it had quite a marked effect in raising the number of meals people had per day. So, and it is quite, although it's tiny relative to income levels in rural Malawi, it's quite significant. So it does sort of raise those who are receiving it significantly above the other households that aren't, particularly if there are children in the household, because there's a supplement for children.
Okay, great. So we're coming to the last few minutes of the presentation, and had a stimulating set of discussions around particularly around targeting, which always raises a lot of questions, and which I think was one of the really interesting points from the research. Just in the last few minutes, I'm just going to invite you to wrap up with any final points from each of the panelists. Nicola, maybe starting with you.
I'm not sure. I mean, I just sort of reiterate that I think that what we've done by undertaking this sort of case study type research that really goes into depth or into how cash transfers impact on social relations, I think we have uncovered some interesting angles there. And just to sort of reiterate our 3 points, really, that firstly, the household targeting doesn't make sense. It doesn't actually identify those that are most or perceived to be most vulnerable. So it's perceived as arbitrary. And so it leads to a lot of jealousy. Secondly, that the elderly are seen as deserving recipients, and a social pension, particularly if it's universal, is very acceptable, and it benefits far more than just the elderly. And thirdly, that young people don't just want cash, they want to be able to contribute to their families and to their communities in more meaningful ways. You know, they are looking for work.
Great, thank you. Thandie, any last thoughts?
I also just want to add that I think the research really brings interesting questions to the table. Specifically, we are asking if is targeting something that can be fair, and in what settings can it be fair, but specifically speaking to these particular settings of high poverty levels. And we're also asking if maybe universalizing these cash transfers might be a solution. And we are also cognizant of the fact that we are talking about very poor as well. So in what way can maybe universalizing be possible in such settings? And given the wider impact of the elderly pension, we're also saying maybe we should focus on elderly pension because it looks like it has the spillover effects are vast. And so maybe that's what we should focus on. And lastly, looking at young people, I think we want to ask if public works are an option that we can go back to. They used to be popular, not so much anymore. But is it an option that we could go back to in order to help young people?
Great, thank you. And last words to Andrea, particularly where you might want to see the research go further. What else? What are the next steps?
First of all, thank you, Larissa. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the researching team. It's an excellent work, and it's a very interesting read. I think it brings up some nuance on what really happens on the ground and what are the real impacts on community dynamics, which are often hidden when you're looking at aggregated level data. You only see big numbers of beneficiaries covered and etc. But what happens in the daily lives of people, it gets hidden behind the numbers. I think the key messages that Nicola and Thandie were highlighting, well, I completely agree with them. I think there is a lot of opportunity to improve the impact of these transfers by adjusting how and to whom they are delivered. Categorical can be a possibility that is to be well thought to. Pensions usually are a first choice for countries implementing categorical targeting for social protection, and examples from Lesotho, from Thailand that was raised, and from many other countries support that these schemes are sustainable, they produce results not only for the recipients but also for the whole community. And speaking on Malawi, there is interest in the political sphere to introduce a social pension in Malawi, which could also help improve the dynamics of the social cash transfer itself. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the people watching this webinar. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you very much, Andre. And I should also add that all the comments that have come in keep on saying how great the research is and how interesting the presentations have been. So thank you very much to all the panelist members, all the panelists. Thank you to all of those of you that were attending online, listening online. The research is all available, as Nicola said at the start, on the website, which I now can't see the website for. And I think it's also available on socialprotection.org as well. I think there are links to the research there and the blogs that have been written. I'm sorry for any of the questions that we didn't cover, but thank you again for all those that were able to attend. And thank you again, panelists.
Well, thank you for people for listening and watching.
All right, goodbye everyone.